Imagine that you are standing at sea level. The atmospheric pressure around you is about 101 kilopascals, and oxygen makes up roughly 21% of the air. With every breath, oxygen enters your lungs and then passes into your bloodstream under the force of this pressure. But now, we are going to start climbing. And with every kilometer we ascend, the pressure will fall, and your lungs will receive less oxygen. So, how much can your body actually endure? 1,000 meters. At an altitude of 1,000 meters, air pressure drops to about 89% of its sea level value. This means that every breath gives your body roughly 11% less oxygen. You probably will not notice anything while resting. But when running or climbing stairs, your breathing and heart rate may increase slightly. For most healthy people, this altitude is not dangerous. 2,000 meters. At 2,000 meters, about 78% of sea level air pressure remains. In other words, each breath provides you with roughly 22% less oxygen. You may become tired more quickly, and your breathing may become noticeably heavier during physical activity. However, most people can remain here normally, especially if they ascend gradually. 3,000 meters. At 3,000 meters, air pressure falls to about 69% of its sea level value. You are now receiving nearly 1/3 less oxygen with every breath. This is where symptoms of altitude sickness may begin. Headache, nausea, dizziness, fatigue, and difficulty sleeping. These symptoms may begin several hours after arrival, especially if you climb too quickly. Your body tries to compensate by increasing your breathing rate and raising your heart rate, but full acclimatization does not happen within minutes. It takes days. 4,000 meters. At 4,000 meters, only about 61% of sea level air pressure remains. This means your body has lost access to roughly 39% of the oxygen normally available with every breath. Even while resting, your breathing may become faster, and while you sleep, your body may enter a strange breathing pattern. You breathe rapidly, then your breathing slows down or stops for a few moments. Then you wake up gasping for air, and if someone continues climbing despite the symptoms, fluid may begin accumulating inside the lungs. At first, shortness of breath appears during movement. Then it remains even while sitting still. This is a medical emergency that can be fatal. 5,000 meters. At 5,000 meters, air pressure drops to about 53% of sea level pressure. Oxygen still makes up 21% of the air, but every breath provides you with only about half the amount your body is used to receiving. A short walk may feel like an intense workout. Your heart rate rises, your muscles slow down, and your brain may begin to suffer. Concentration weakens, reaction times become slower, and decisions become less accurate. In severe cases, fluid may begin accumulating inside the brain. The person begins to lose their balance. They may become unable to walk in a straight line. Then confusion or hallucinations may appear. At this point, descending quickly becomes far more important than continuing upward. 6,000 meters. At 6,000 meters, about 47% of sea level pressure remains. This means your body has lost access to more than half the oxygen normally available in every breath. A person can remain here for a limited period after acclimatizing, but sleeping becomes difficult, appetite weakens, and the body begins losing weight and muscle mass. To compensate, the body produces more red blood cells. This allows the blood to carry more oxygen, but it can also make the blood thicker and force the heart to work harder. 7,000 meters. At 7,000 meters, you receive only about 41% of the oxygen available at sea level. Every movement requires more effort. Even simple tasks become slow. Closing a bag, putting on a glove, or tying a rope. These tasks can take a very long time, not because the person has forgotten how to do them, but because the brain and muscles are operating with far less oxygen than normal. And here, one small mistake can become a fatal decision. 8,000 meters. At 8,000 meters, air pressure drops to about 35% of sea level pressure. This means that every breath gives you only about 1/3 of the usual amount of oxygen. This is where what is known as the death zone begins. Above this altitude, the human body can no longer fully acclimatize. The body does not improve the longer it stays. It begins to deteriorate. Muscles break down. Digestion slows. Thinking becomes impaired, and wounds heal with difficulty. Hallucinations and loss of direction may also occur. This is why people cannot live permanently above 8,000 meters. Even professional climbers try to spend as little time there as possible. The summit of Mount Everest. At the summit of Mount Everest, at an altitude of approximately 8,849 meters, air pressure is about 1/3 of the pressure at sea level. This means that every breath gives a climber roughly 1/3 of the usual amount of oxygen. That is why most climbers use supplemental oxygen. Even then, breathing remains difficult, thinking becomes slower, and every step becomes shorter. A climber may need to take several breaths just to complete a single step. An altitude of 10 kilometers. At 10 kilometers, only about 26% of sea level pressure remains. You are now receiving roughly 1/4 of the usual amount of oxygen with every breath. This is close to the cruising altitude of some passenger aircraft. Outside the aircraft, a person cannot breathe normally. They may lose the ability to think and act within a very short period. That is why aircraft cabins are pressurized. They do not fully reproduce sea level pressure, but they usually maintain pressure equivalent to an altitude of approximately 1,800 to 2,400 meters. An altitude of 12 kilometers. At 12 kilometers, only about 19% of sea level pressure remains. This means your body receives less than 1/5 of the usual amount of oxygen with every breath. If an aircraft loses cabin pressure at this altitude, the amount of oxygen reaching the brain falls rapidly. At first, you may experience dizziness or a strange feeling of euphoria. Then, your ability to think becomes impaired. After that, you may lose the ability to put on an oxygen mask by yourself. This is why the masks drop immediately when cabin pressure is lost. An altitude of 15 kilometers. At 15 kilometers, only about 12% of sea level pressure remains. Even breathing pure oxygen may not be enough without adequate pressure. The problem is no longer only the amount of oxygen. The pressure itself has become too low to push oxygen effectively from the lungs into the bloodstream. That is why pilots operating at these altitudes require pressurized cabins or specialized pressure suits. An altitude of 19 kilometers. At approximately 19 kilometers, air pressure drops to around 6% of sea level pressure. This is where you reach the Armstrong limit. The pressure has become so low that water can boil at the temperature of the human body, approximately 37 degrees Celsius. The blood inside your vessels would not immediately boil because it is still under pressure. But saliva, tears, and moisture inside the lungs may begin to vaporize, and gases inside the body begin to expand. Without a pressurized suit, survival becomes impossible. 50 kilometers. At an altitude of 50 kilometers, air pressure is less than 1/1000th of sea level pressure. This means the available oxygen has fallen to less than 0.1% of its normal level. There is no longer enough air for the lungs to use. Any unprotected person would quickly lose consciousness because of oxygen deprivation and extremely low pressure. 100 kilometers. At 100 kilometers, you reach the Kármán line, commonly used as the boundary marking the beginning of space. The pressure here is only a tiny fraction of sea level pressure and can be considered a near vacuum. If a person left a spacecraft without a suit, they would not explode, but they would most likely lose consciousness within about 10 to 15 seconds. The air inside the lungs would expand, and if the person held their breath, their lungs could suffer a serious rupture. The body's tissues would swell. Saliva and tears would begin to vaporize, but death would not come from instantly freezing. It would come from oxygen deprivation and the absence of pressure. Brief conclusion. At 3,000 meters, you lose access to roughly 1/3 of the oxygen normally available with every breath. At 5,000 meters, only about half remains. At 8,000 meters, you receive only 1/3. And at the altitude of passenger aircraft, the brain may have only a short amount of time before losing the ability to function. Then, at 19 kilometers, the pressure becomes so low that exposed bodily fluids may begin to boil. Altitude does not kill a person all at once. It gradually strips away oxygen, movement, and the ability to think, stage by stage, until the body can no longer continue.